Hello, scientific writers. I was having a conversation with the professor a while back, and we were talking about writing journal articles, or writing research papers. And this professor said to me, I was always taught not to wee all over my paper. And that cracked me up. I thought it was so funny. And what he was talking about was using first person and how he was taught not to use I or we in the paper. And so I thought this would make a great video for this channel. Should you wee all over your paper? When you first hear that, you might think of something like this puppy who has his newspapers as he's learning to live in a house. He has to be trained, and he might wee on his papers. That's not really what I'm talking about. Or maybe I'm talking about this kind of wee. Well, not really, but I think it would be great if you were having that much fun as you were writing your paper. If you have been watching my course, Expert Scientific Writing Techniques, you'll probably know that using I or we, those first person pronouns, means that you're using active voice. And I do recommend in that course to use active voice most of the time. However, I don't like to use too many we's. And I have some previous videos about what I call false active voice. So I'll link to that playlist and I'll link to those previous videos. You've probably seen the links pop up above already. I'll also put them down in the description for this video. Now, as I was sitting down thinking about what to put in this video, I thought, well, maybe I should do some research and just see how prevalent the we's are. How many people are wee-weeing all over their paper? So I went into the journal PLOS One, a multidisciplinary, well-known open access journal. And I just went in and counted the number of we's in 100 articles. The number of we uses in these 100 articles in PLOS One ranged from 0 to over 120. The mean use of we's was 25, with the standard deviation of 23.7. So this was more than I expected. I didn't expect to see that many we's, and there were quite a few that were over 100, and I was a little bit shocked when I saw that. I was expecting a lower number of we's, something like 5 to 10, but in fact the median number was 18. So I thought maybe this is just PLOS One because it's a multidisciplinary journal and I'm counting some social sciences and some psychology and other sciences outside of the life sciences. So I decided to look at a few other open access journals and see how many we's were being used there. And I actually found even higher numbers of we's. So I looked at about 20 articles from each of these journals. PLOS Biology had an average of 54.5 we's. PLOS Genetics had even more. They had 68.5 we's. Frontiers in Plant Science had the least of these four at 17.4, and Frontiers in Genetics had 25.3. So about the same as PLOS One. So what I decided to do next was to look at how the we's are being used. So I started going through and looking at each sentence that contained the word we, and I came up with a set of categories, and I also looked at the section in which the we was occurring. So I just picked a few articles. I picked some that had a very low usage of we's, 2 that had a medium number of we's, and I picked 3 that had high numbers of we's. I categorized these as describing the background, describing the methods, describing results, describing thought process, or acknowledgments. Most of these 4 describing categories occurred in all of the sections. What I found was that most of the we's are describing methods, but not in the materials and methods section. They're using the we's to describe the methods in the results section. Okay, so how does that work? That's when they're using this repeating pattern that I talk about in my Write Your Scientific Journal article course, where they give a little bit of background, an overview of the method they used, the results, and then the interpretation of that result. And so they're choosing to use we when they're describing the methods part of that repeating pattern. And you can see that in this heat map here, where we have the highest concentration of uses of we. The second highest concentration is describing the thought process in the results section. And this is something that I was surprised to see. I know a lot of authors like to describe their process in the results section, but if I were writing it, if I were a co-author, I would not do it that way. I would keep the results section purely results, very descriptive of what's actually happening, with some interpretation in the context of the experiment as needed, and keep that thought process in the introduction and in the discussion. We see a lot of describing the thought process in the results, and then a lot of describing results in results. Some examples of describing background would be, we have previously reported that implantation of flow modifying stents within the coronary arteries of transgenic hypocholesterolemic pigs caused the development of advanced plaques. So in this sentence, what they're doing is they're describing the background, and they want to let the readers know that this background was accomplished by the author's research group themselves. So that makes sense to me. I can see how that is useful use of the we. A very similar thing is going on in this next sentence. We previously used a PSLA technique developed to print binary structures using polyethylene glycol-based hydrogels. The third example says, hence, we carried out treatment experiments on mice using RNase A, RNA degrader, or DNase I, DNA degrader. So they're telling that they carried out these experiments. I think if you tried hard, you could eliminate this use of we and just say what the experiments were. It's obvious that the authors carried them out, so it's really not necessary to say we did that. The thing I don't like about that phrasing is that it's making the we the subject of the sentence instead of having the research be the subject of the sentence. The fourth example is, we and others have observed differential methylation patterns across the spectrum of squamous neoplastic progression. So very similar to the first two examples. Let's look at some examples of describing methods. We used the following PCR program to amplify porcine, bowhead, and shark amplicons of 318 base pairs, 238 base pairs, and 322 base pairs, respectively. And the sentence goes on, we adopted a universal sampling method and sent an electronic self-administered closed-end anonymous survey to all 20,000 students who were actively enrolled at X University in spring 2019. The third example is, we used the lincom command in Stata to derive 95% confidence intervals for T and EMR, and we used the root mean square error and mean absolute error to evaluate goodness of the fitted temperature curve. Now, for all of these method sentences, especially if it's in the materials and methods section, which is preferably written in the passive voice, all of these sentences could be rewritten to eliminate the we. Because again, it's making the authors the subject of the sentence rather than the experiment that they're describing being the subject. So I would prefer to eliminate this use of we. Examples for describing results. We found that serum increases embryo diameter and total cell number, alleviates ER stress, and affects autophagic activity, etc. All right, we found that. If you cross out we found that and just say serum increased embryo diameter and total cell number, alleviated ER stress, the sentence says the same thing. It's shorter, and you've eliminated the we and put the focus back on the science and off of the authors. So I would really recommend that you do it that way instead of saying we found that. This is what I call the false active voice. The second example is, we were unable to establish a link between DM duration and HCC development in this investigation. I might keep that. I would have to look at the context of the paragraph, but by using that construction, we were unable to establish a link, it makes it clear to the reader that the authors are talking about this particular study, not that in the broader literature there is no link between these two items. Third example, by looking at the aggregated social capital index, we see that it significantly associates with each public behavior. Again, we could cross out we see that, and we could just say the aggregated social capital index significantly associated with each public behavior. It's the same information, now the focus is back on the science, off of the authors. And the fourth example, as we have seen, the vision condition had a significant effect on the spectral balance. All right, I'm not sure why we need the phrase "as we have seen." It's some kind of a meta-discourse or a transition phrase, but maybe it's not really necessary. It might be helpful to the readers, but it could probably be done with a different type of transition that doesn't put the focus on to the authors. All right, 4 examples of describing the thought process. By taking such an approach, we aim to allow regular and frequent on-site measurements by volunteer groups across a wide area not previously achieved. Now, this could be easily reworded to take out the we. The we is not necessary. It could just say, such an approach would allow regular and frequent on-site measurements, etc. The we is really not crucial to that sentence. The next example, we argue that this focus has potential drawbacks because developments during the pandemic, etc., etc. Well, that one's on the fence for me. I think you could leave that we, but you could write the sentence without it. I think it's okay because this is probably coming in the discussion section or the conclusions, but it seems like that kind of a sentence. I would probably leave this we in place. The third example, thus, we hypothesize 2 possible reasoning style mechanisms. Yeah, that one I think you could leave the we or you could get rid of it. If you were to say something like, there are 2 possible reasoning style mechanisms, that's a little bit risky because a reader might easily see a third possible mechanism. And here you've stated something that there are only 2 possible mechanisms. So it might come off as a little overly confident. So saying we hypothesize that there are 2 possible mechanisms is a little bit more hedging, actually might be a better construction. The 4th example says, given these observations, we predicted that the highly fragmented and agriculturally dominant landscape of central Illinois would impede vole dispersal. Yeah, I think this one could easily be rewritten without the we, but it's okay. I think it's okay. I would probably leave it there. So what are my conclusions? Should you we all over your paper? I think looking at the numbers of how it's actually being used and looking at examples of how it's being used, I think we is being used too much in some of these papers. Now the ones that are using 10 or less clearly are not using too many we's, in my opinion. The mid-range, yeah, they could probably lose a few of those, get it down to fewer uses of we. The ones that are using over 100 we's, yeah, I mean, in my opinion, that's just way too much. And the reason is because the story should be about the science. The story should not be about, hey, look at what we did in our laboratory. We did this and we thought that, and then we did this experiment and we found that and we concluded that. I would really prefer it to be about the science, not about the scientists. I lean towards the more conservative side where fewer we's is better. So I would say do not we all over your paper. If you have a different opinion about that, change my mind. I'm happy to hear it. Leave a comment down below and we can have a discussion. All right, I hope that was interesting and helpful to you. I'll see you next time and happy writing.